My son gifted me a luxury trip to Cambodia. He stood on the airport curb, handed me a passport, and told me to rest my aging mind. But the moment he drove away, a stranger approached me with a warning that shattered my reality. He told me he overheard my son plotting to clear out my estate the second my flight took off. I checked my ticket and realized I was being permanently exiled. I am Joseph Watkins, 70 years old, and I spent my entire life building an empire only to have my only child attempt to steal it. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who completely underestimated your intelligence. The morning air at the International Departure Terminal carried the sharp scent of jet fuel and exhaust. I stood on the concrete curb, gripping the handle of my rolling suitcase with my calloused hands. Nathan, the son I had groomed to take over my logistics empire, stood opposite me. He wore a tailored navy suit purchased with a corporate expense account I had personally authorized. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around my shoulders. The embrace lacked any genuine warmth. It was a cold, mechanical gesture, executed purely for the benefit of passing travelers and airport security cameras. He stepped back instantly and reached into his jacket pocket. He handed me a sleek brown leather passport holder. He patted my arm with a patronizing rhythm. He told me I had worked tirelessly for 50 years, and it was finally time to step away from the daily operations. He claimed my aging mind desperately needed an extended vacation to recover from the stress of my late wife's passing. I accepted the passport holder, observing the forced, tight smile on his face. I had handed him the daily management of my freight company 5 years ago, believing a formal education made him a superior leader. I nodded, thanking him for the extravagant gesture, entirely unaware of the trap closing around me. Nathan turned his back to me without a second glance. He slid into the driver's seat of a customized black sports car, an extravagant vehicle paid for by the company's operating capital. The engine roared, and he merged aggressively into the airport traffic, leaving me alone on the crowded sidewalk. I adjusted my heavy winter coat and prepared to walk toward the sliding glass doors of the departure hall. A firm hand gripped my forearm. I turned to find a middle-aged man wearing a faded denim jacket and carrying a battered canvas duffel bag. His eyes were wide with a mix of sheer disbelief and urgent concern. He introduced himself as Oliver. He explained he had been standing directly behind the concrete pillar where Nathan had just parked his vehicle. Oliver spoke rapidly, keeping his voice low to avoid drawing a crowd of curious onlookers. He told me he had overheard my son speaking on a phone call through his car's Bluetooth system. Oliver identified the woman on the other end of the line as Nathan's white wife, Megan. He repeated their conversation word for word. Nathan had called Megan the exact second he closed his car door. He told his wife the airport drop-off was completely successful. Oliver took a step closer, ensuring I heard his next sentence clearly over the roar of a passing shuttle bus. He revealed that Nathan had told Megan the old man was finally gone for good. He instructed her to contact the commercial moving crews immediately. He ordered her to clear out my entire estate before nightfall, stripping the house of everything my late wife and I had collected over 4 decades. The physical impact of those words hit me with the force of a concrete block. My lungs tightened, and the bustling noise of the airport terminal faded into a dull, distant ringing. My own son had orchestrated a massive home invasion disguised as a luxury vacation. I felt a sudden, violent spike of adrenaline, but I absolutely refused to succumb to panic. Panic is a useless emotion designed for victims. I had survived 50 years as an African-American man in the ruthless freight industry by maintaining total emotional control during a crisis. I stabilized my breathing and looked Oliver directly in the eyes. I thanked him for his integrity and his courage. I did not ask him for further details. I gripped the handle of my suitcase, turned my back on the departure gates, and walked straight toward the interior airline customer service desk. The line at the customer service counter moved agonizingly slowly. I maintained a perfectly neutral expression as I approached the uniformed agent. I handed her my passport and the booking confirmation number Nathan had printed for me. I requested a complete physical copy of my entire flight itinerary. The agent typed rapidly on her keyboard, her brow furrowing in confusion. She stared at her monitor for a long moment before looking back up at me. She printed a single sheet of paper and slid it across the polished counter. She informed me in a polite, apologetic tone that there was no return flight on record. Nathan had not booked a round-trip vacation. He had purchased a one-way ticket to Phnom Penh, Cambodia. I stared at the black ink on the white paper. The geographical reality of his plan became crystal clear. He intended to drop me in a developing nation on the other side of the planet with no prearranged method of returning home. The luxury vacation was a meticulously planned deportation. My son had permanently exiled me from my own life. He had calculated that an old man stranded in a foreign country would be entirely powerless to stop a hostile Sailamu takeover. I did not waste a single second arguing with the airline agent. I pulled my wallet from my interior jacket pocket and extracted my primary corporate credit card. I instructed the agent to book me the next available first-class return flight from Cambodia to American soil. I wanted to establish a documented paper trail of my financial assets. I handed her the card. She swiped the magnetic strip through her terminal. The machine emitted a sharp negative beep. She tried it a second time. She looked at me with genuine pity and informed me the transaction was entirely declined. I remained completely silent. I pulled out my personal black card, an account I had maintained in perfect standing for 3 decades. She ran the chip through the reader. The result was identical. The account was completely frozen. The absolute scope of Nathan's betrayal materialized in front of me. He had not just exiled me physically. He and Megan had executed a total financial severance. They had locked me out of my own wealth, leaving me stranded at an international terminal with zero access to my lifetime of earnings. I took my frozen credit cards back and walked away from the desk. I was 70 years old, broke, and officially at war with my own son. I stepped away from the ticketing counter and looked down at my matching set of leather suitcases. Nathan had insisted on purchasing them for my trip. He claimed the smart luggage tags would prevent the airline from losing my belongings. Now staring at the sleek plastic squares clipped to the handles, I recognized them for what they truly were. They were digital leashes. My son needed to monitor my exact location to ensure I boarded that flight to Cambodia. I dragged the suitcases into a crowded men's restroom near the food court. I carried them into a handicap stall and locked the heavy metal door. I snapped the reinforced smart tags off the handles with a sharp twist of my wrists. I dropped the electronic trackers into the toilet and flushed them down without hesitation. I unzipped the main compartment of the largest suitcase. I removed only a thick wool sweater and a spare pair of reading glasses, stuffing them into the small canvas tote I carried over my shoulder. Everything else was completely expendable. I walked out of the restroom and pushed the expensive luggage directly into an overflowing industrial trash bin near the exit. I could not afford to be weighed down. I could not afford to broadcast my coordinates to the man actively stealing my life. The physical relief of shedding the dead weight immediately sharpened my focus. I blended into the rushing crowds of the international terminal, keeping my head down and my brimmed hat pulled low. I navigated the vast concourse by instinct, mapping the blind spots between the overhead security cameras. This type of hyper-vigilant situational awareness was not something I learned in a corporate boardroom. I developed it 40 years ago. Back then, I was a young black man driving freight trucks through the most unforgiving industrial sectors of Chicago and Detroit. I learned to read the shifting energy of a loading dock, to spot an ambush before the shadows even moved, and to always locate the fastest exit. I used that exact street-level survival instinct to build Watkins Freight from a single rusted rig into a national logistics empire. I knew the routes. I knew the dangers. I knew how to outmaneuver predators. I had foolishly believed my success had insulated my family from that kind of ruthless environment. I assumed the wealth I accumulated would grant my son a life of intellectual refinement. Instead, the privilege merely sharpened Nathan's greed. He weaponized the education I paid for to execute a hostile takeover of his own father. I kept my pace steady and even slipping past a group of distracted tourists and sliding toward the restricted corridors. I needed to vanish completely from the grid. I bypassed the glowing signs pointing toward the ride-share pickup zones. Booking a car through an application linked to my name or phone number would immediately flag my location on Nathan's devices. He and Megan would be monitoring every digital footprint I possessed. I pushed open a heavy metal fire door marked for authorized personnel only. The harsh wail of an alarm sounded briefly before the heavy steel sealed shut behind me, cutting off the noise. I emerged onto a grimy, oil-stained access road utilized strictly by catering trucks and maintenance vehicles. The freezing morning air bit into my lungs. I walked a quarter of a mile down the concrete ramp until I reached the chaotic outer perimeter of the airport transit hub. A line of battered independent taxicabs idled near a chain-link fence waiting for overflow passengers. I approached the oldest vehicle in the lineup. I tapped on the window. The driver, an older man smoking a cigarette, rolled down the glass. I pulled a folded $100 bill from the emergency money clip I always kept pinned to the inside of my belt. I held the crisp currency up to the window and demanded a cash-only ride with the meter completely turned off. The driver glanced at the money, tossed his cigarette onto the asphalt, and unlocked the back door without asking a single question. I settled into the cracked vinyl seat and instructed the driver to head inbound toward the city center. I ordered him to avoid the primary interstate highways and stick strictly to the secondary arterial roads. I needed to buy time to assess the exact damage Nathan had inflicted. I pulled out my wallet and laid my remaining assets out on my lap. I possessed my passport, an effectively useless piece of plastic, considering my current financial lockdown. I had my mobile phone, which I immediately powered down and removed the battery from to prevent any cellular triangulation. Finally, I counted the remaining cash in my emergency clip. I had exactly $300. It was a terrifyingly finite sum for a man who managed a company with a $50 million operating budget. Every asset, every property, and every investment account tied to the Watkins name was currently held hostage by a forged signature. Nathan and Megan had executed a flawless ambush while I was packing my bags for a vacation I was never meant to return from. They assumed my age equated to weakness. They believed I would simply accept defeat and fade quietly into the background of a foreign country. They were completely wrong. I stacked the bills neatly and slid them back into my pocket. I looked out the smeared window of the taxi as the urban skyline approached. Returning to my primary estate was tactical suicide. Megan was undoubtedly standing in my foyer right now, directing her hired crews to strip my sanctuary bare. The residential security codes would be altered, and the local police would be presented with fraudulent medical documents, claiming I was a confused, trespassing dementia patient. I needed an operational base completely disconnected from my corporate identity. I leaned forward and tapped the acrylic partition dividing the taxi. I gave the driver a new destination. I directed him away from the affluent residential zones and toward the sprawling, neglected warehouses of the southern industrial district. I was heading to an auto repair shop owned by a man named Hank. Hank was a retired police detective. 15 years ago, I utilized my company's legal resources to quietly shield Hank from a politically motivated internal affairs purge that threatened to destroy his pension and his family. I saved his livelihood when the city abandoned him. Hank owed me a life debt, and he possessed the exact type of off-the-grid operational security I required to launch a counteroffensive. The taxi rattled over the train tracks as we crossed into the industrial zone. The silent adjustment was officially underway. The cash-only taxi idled at the curb of a sprawling, corrugated metal building in the southern industrial district. Faded painted letters on the brick facade read, "Hank's Automotive." I handed the driver the remaining balance of the fare and stepped out into the biting wind. The scent of motor oil, burned rubber, and hot metal hung heavy in the air. I walked past a row of dismantled engines and approached the main garage bay. Hank stood beneath the hydraulic lift of a classic muscle car, wiping grease from his hands with a red rag. He was a man built like a cinder block, a retired police detective who traded his badge for a wrench 15 years ago after a political scandal almost ruined him. I had provided the legal muscle to save his pension back then. He looked up. His eyes locked onto my face. Hank possessed the instincts of a man who survived decades on the vice squad. He did not offer a casual greeting or ask why I was standing in his shop instead of boarding a flight to Cambodia. He read the absolute zero in my expression. Hank tossed the rag onto a workbench, walked past me and grabbed the heavy steel chain hanging from the main bay door. He hauled the chain downward. The massive corrugated metal door slammed against the concrete floor with a deafening crash. He threw the heavy deadbolt into place and killed the exterior overhead lights. The garage plunged into the dim, buzzing glow of fluorescent shop lamps. We were completely sealed off from the street. Hank gestured toward a reinforced steel door at the back of the garage leading to his private office. I walked into the soundproof room and took a seat in a worn leather chair. The isolation was immediate and entirely necessary. Hank poured 2 cups of black coffee from a stained carafe and set one on the desk in front of me. I did not waste time with emotional embellishments. I stated the facts with absolute precision. I informed him that my son Nathan had canceled my return flight and frozen every personal and corporate credit account linked to my name. I explained the forced exile to Southeast Asia and the impending liquidation of my estate. Hank listened in complete silence. He did not offer useless sympathy or express disbelief. He operated purely on tactical logic. He opened a locked filing cabinet behind his desk and extracted a small, heavy biometric safe. He punched in a digital code and pulled out a pristine, untraceable burner phone and a military-grade secure laptop. He slid the devices across the desk. Hank explained the laptop operated on an encrypted virtual private network routed through multiple international servers. It was entirely invisible to local tracking software. He handed me the phone and stated the number was clean, purchased with cash under a fictitious corporate entity. I powered on the laptop. The glowing screen represented my only operational link to the empire I had built. I needed to bypass Nathan's financial blockade and access my secondary reserves before he completely dismantled my infrastructure. I could not fight a war with exactly $300 in my pocket. I connected the encrypted laptop to Hank's secured network. I navigated directly to a hidden offshore registry Hank maintained for his high-profile security clients. Years ago, I had established a series of secondary corporate accounts within this registry to act as a financial firewall. These accounts held operational capital entirely separated from the primary logistics firm. I typed in my master credentials. The screen buffered for a fraction of a second before displaying a glaring red error message: access denied. I re-entered the complex alphanumeric sequence, assuming a simple keystroke error. The identical red warning flashed across the screen. My jaw tightened. I initiated the emergency protocol to bypass the primary login and access the root directory of the holding company. The system prompted a secondary security hurdle. A prompt appeared demanding a 6-digit dual authentication code. The text below the prompt stated the authentication token had been sent to the primary administrator's mobile device. The system displayed the last 4 digits of the registered phone number. It was Nathan's personal cellular device. The magnitude of his digital infiltration became devastatingly clear. My son had not merely frozen my public credit cards. He had actively hunted down my hidden corporate reserves and successfully petitioned the registry to override my master passwords. He had transferred the ultimate administrative control of my emergency capital directly to his own phone. I was entirely locked out of the financial fortress I had constructed. Nathan had built a flawless digital cage around my assets. He assumed a 70-year-old man lacked the technological sophistication to break a dual authentication blockade. He had effectively cut off my oxygen supply. Hank noticed the rigid set of my shoulders. He did not ask about the red error message flashing on the screen. He turned to his own desktop monitor and accessed the municipal traffic grid. As a former detective, Hank maintained backdoor access to the city's network of intersection cameras. He rapidly typed in the coordinates of my primary residential estate. The screen flickered and brought up a high-definition live feed of my street. The visual confirmation was instantaneous. Two massive 18-wheel commercial moving trucks were parked aggressively across my driveway. The heavy steel ramps were deployed, crushing the manicured hedges lining the entrance. A crew of a dozen men moved rapidly back and forth from the front doors, carrying heavy crates and large pieces of wrapped furniture directly into the cargo bays. The systematic gutting of my home was happening in real time. My private sanctuary was being dismantled piece by piece. The antique grandfather clock my late wife had purchased in London was unceremoniously shoved into the back of a truck by two careless laborers. I watched a lifetime of memories being treated as expendable inventory. I watched the foreman bark orders waving a clipboard that undoubtedly held Nathan's forged signature. I leaned closer to the monitor. I scrutinized the stark white logo emblazoned on the side of the commercial moving trucks. It was Vanguard Freight and Transport. My breath hitched slightly. Vanguard was a subsidiary contractor entirely managed by my own logistics firm. I had personally vetted their operating licenses a decade ago to handle overflow commercial shipping. The realization sharpened my focus into a razor edge. Nathan was not using a random local moving company to liquidate my personal life. He was actively deploying my own corporate resources to execute his theft. He was billing the destruction of his father's estate directly to the company ledger. The sheer arrogance of the maneuver was staggering. He felt so completely insulated by his forged medical documents and his financial blockades that he did not even attempt to hide his tracks. He was using the empire I built with my own hands to finance my erasure. I stepped back from the monitor. The initial shock evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. Nathan thought he was playing a game of simple subtraction. He did not realize I wrote the rules of corporate warfare long before he was born. I turned to Hank and requested the keys to his unmarked utility van. It was time to leave the shadows and observe my enemies up close. Hank did not ask for permission before grabbing a set of keys from a rusted pegboard. He led me through the back exit of the garage toward a dented, unmarked utility van parked in the alleyway. The vehicle was entirely anonymous, the kind of vehicle designed to disappear into the background of any urban landscape. We climbed inside, and the engine rattled to life. Hank steered the van out of the industrial district and navigated the winding suburban roads with the practiced precision of a man who spent decades tailing suspects. He knew exactly how to utilize the blind spots of the affluent neighborhoods. We approached the perimeter of my estate from a service road that ran parallel to the main boulevard. Hank killed the headlights and eased the van into the deep shadows cast by a row of ancient oak trees directly opposite my property. He shifted the transmission into park and cut the engine. The silence inside the cabin was immediate and absolute. We sat in the cold darkness, peering through the tinted windshield. The view of my home was unobstructed. The heavy iron gates stood wide open, a blatant violation of my security protocols. The two massive commercial trucks from my own logistics firm dominated the circular driveway. The operation was moving at a frantic, highly coordinated pace. I watched the laborers swarm my property like scavengers stripping a carcass. My sanctuary, the fortress I had built to protect my family, was entirely breached. Megan stood in the center of the manicured lawn, dictating the destruction of my life with absolute authority. She wore a tailored white cashmere coat that starkly contrasted with the grease and sweat of the moving crew. She held a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and pointed sharply toward the front doors with the other. I watched as two burly men struggled to carry a solid mahogany armoire down the front steps. That armoire had belonged to my late wife. We had purchased it during a trip to New Orleans to celebrate our 10th wedding anniversary. It was a piece of our history, a tangible reminder of the woman who helped me build everything from the ground up. Megan did not direct the men toward the padded cargo bay of the moving truck. She pointed her manicured finger directly toward a massive industrial dumpster positioned on the edge of the property. The workers hesitated for a fraction of a second before heaving the heavy antique over the metal rim. The sickening crunch of shattering wood echoed across the quiet street. Megan took a calm sip of her coffee. She despised the warmth and history embedded in my home. She had always complained that the dark wood and vintage textiles felt suffocating and outdated. She craved a sterile monochromatic aesthetic, a luxury devoid of soul or struggle. Throwing my wife's legacy into a steel trash bin was not a logistical necessity. It was an act of pure, calculated erasure. She was physically wiping my existence from the estate to make room for her hollow, manufactured reality. I sat in the freezing van and committed every detail of her arrogance to memory. A sleek silver sedan turned sharply into the driveway, forcing the moving crew to scatter. Nathan stepped out of the vehicle, smoothing the lapels of his designer suit. He did not look like a man orchestrating the illegal eviction of his own father. He looked like an executive closing a minor business transaction. He walked briskly across the lawn and handed Megan a thick legal folder. Megan opened the flap, inspected the documents inside, and let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. She threw her arms around Nathan's neck. They celebrated openly on the grass, surrounded by the debris of my dismantled life. Nathan smiled, kissing his wife's forehead with genuine affection. I observed his face closely through the tinted glass. I searched his features for a single ounce of hesitation, a microscopic shadow of guilt or regret. I found absolutely nothing. He stood on the lawn he had played on as a child, completely unburdened by conscience. He believed I was currently lost in an airport in Cambodia, stripped of my mind and my money. He looked entirely victorious. I looked down at my hands resting on my knees. The skin was rough, scarred by decades of gripping steering wheels, loading cargo, and turning wrenches in freezing warehouses. I remembered the exact afternoon I handed Nathan the keys to the logistics firm. He had just graduated from an elite business school, armed with a degree that cost more than my first 10 trucks combined. I had looked at his smooth, unblemished hands and felt a profound sense of pride. I foolishly believed that his education and his cultivated privilege made him a superior leader. I thought providing him with a frictionless ascent to power would secure the future of the company. I assumed his sophisticated vocabulary and boardroom polish represented a higher level of intelligence. Sitting in the cold utility van, watching him gleefully destroy my estate, the devastating truth crystallized in my mind. The privilege had not made him a better man. It had simply insulated him from the consequences of struggle. The elite education did not instill him with honor or integrity. It merely gave him the legal vocabulary to execute corporate theft. I had handed my life's work to a man who viewed my calloused hands with quiet disgust. His sophisticated upbringing had not eliminated his greed. It had refined it into a weapon. Hank shifted his weight in the driver's seat. The heavy silence in the van pressed against us. He kept his eyes locked on the moving crew, tossing another box of my personal files into the transport truck. He reached slowly toward his jacket pocket and pulled out his mobile phone. He turned to me, his voice a low, steady rumble. He asked if I wanted him to call the local precinct right now to report an active home invasion. He stated he still knew the patrol sergeants in this district and could have 6 squad cars blocking the driveway within 3 minutes. I shook my head and pushed his hand down. I told him to put the phone away. Calling the local police would only halt a burglary. It would trigger a messy domestic dispute over property rights and forged documents. Nathan would hire an army of defense attorneys to tie the matter up in civil court for years. I refused to let him escape with a simple trespassing charge. Letting them finish the crime, letting them complete the financial transfers, and finalize the fraudulent paperwork established a rock-solid foundation for a massive federal indictment. I wanted the fraud investigators and the absolute destruction of his corporate standing. I told Hank to start the engine. We had gathered all the visual confirmation we needed. The trap was set. Hank shifted the utility van into drive and navigated away from the affluent residential streets. We left my dismantled estate behind and headed directly toward the towering glass structures of the central financial district. I did not say a single word during the 40-minute ride. I utilized the silence to compartmentalize the rage. Emotion clouding my judgment was exactly what Nathan was counting on. We parked in an underground structure beneath a prestigious skyscraper. Hank swiped his security card to grant us access to the private executive elevators. We rode up to the 52nd floor. The polished oak doors of Thorne and Associates stood in front of me. I bypassed the stunned receptionist at the marble front desk entirely. She called out my name, but I ignored her, walking with a heavy, deliberate stride down the corridor, lined with expensive modern art. I reached the heavy mahogany doors at the end of the hall and pushed them open without knocking. Elliot Thorne sat behind his massive desk. Elliot was my ruthless corporate attorney. I had hired him 2 decades ago specifically because he lacked a moral compass when it came to corporate warfare. He was a legal shark who understood that loyalty in business was purchased, not earned. He looked up from his dual monitors, his pen freezing midair. He stared at me as if a ghost had just breached his inner sanctum. Elliot stood up slowly. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, his eyes darting between me and Hank, standing solidly by the door. He stated he had been told I was currently flying over the Pacific Ocean on a mandatory medical retreat. He claimed Nathan had personally informed the executive board just yesterday that my declining health required immediate specialized isolation. I walked across the plush Persian rug and stood directly in front of his desk. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled sheet of paper the airline agent had printed for me. I dropped the one-way ticket to Phnom Penh onto his immaculate mahogany workspace. I told Elliot that my health was perfect, but my son had just committed corporate treason. I instructed him to look at the ticket and calculate the exact legal definition of forced exile. Elliot reviewed the document. His professional demeanor hardened instantly. The shock vanished, replaced by the predatory instinct I paid him handsomely for. I did not give him time to ask useless questions. I issued a direct command. I ordered Elliot to execute a total forensic audit of all my personal and corporate assets effective immediately. I demanded a complete trace of every single dollar moving in and out of Watkins Freight over the last 90 days. I wanted every signature verified, every trust document analyzed, and every bank transfer tracked to its absolute origin. I told him to lock down the perimeter and treat Nathan as a hostile external threat. I reminded Elliot that his lucrative retainer was paid by the founder of the company, not the current operator. If Nathan successfully usurped my empire, Elliot's firm would be the first casualty of the new regime. Nathan preferred weak, compliant lawyers. Elliot understood the stakes immediately. He picked up his desk phone and pressed a single button, summoning his crisis management team. 3 senior financial analysts entered the private office within 60 seconds. Elliot briefed them rapidly, stripping away any pleasantries. He directed them to rip apart the corporate ledger and bypass Nathan's newly established security protocols. The room transformed into a war room. The analysts opened their secure laptops, their fingers flying across the keyboards in tense, absolute silence. The only sound was the hum of the servers and the rapid clicking of keys. Elliot poured a glass of water and offered it to me, suggesting I sit down and order food from the executive kitchen. He noted I had been on my feet since the airport ambush. I rejected the offer completely. Eating requires a sense of security I did not possess. Resting implies the danger has passed. I stood perfectly still by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city I had helped supply for half a century. The immediate physical threat of being deported was neutralized. The conflict had now shifted from raw survival to calculated tactical planning. I was no longer fleeing. I was actively hunting. 2 agonizing hours passed in the quiet office. The lead analyst finally stopped typing and handed a printed dossier to Elliot. Elliot reviewed the first page. The color completely drained from his face. He walked over to me, holding the documents with a rigid grip. He presented the initial findings without any attempt to soften the blow. 3 days ago, Nathan and Megan had filed a formal petition of medical incompetency. They bypassed the standard municipal courts and utilized a private expedited judge known for processing wealthy estate disputes. Attached to the petition was a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. Elliot handed me the evaluation. It bore the letterhead of a highly expensive, out-of-state medical facility I had never set foot in. The document claimed I had been examined multiple times over the past 6 months. It detailed a rapid, irreversible cognitive decline. It stated I was suffering from severe late-stage dementia, rendering me entirely incapable of managing my own physical safety or financial affairs. The signature belonged to a doctor I had never met. Megan had used her high society connections to purchase a fraudulent medical diagnosis. They had legally classified me as a helpless invalid. They had constructed a fictional reality where my son was forced to step in and save the company from a decaying patriarch. The audacity of the forgery was staggering. They did not just want my money. They wanted to strip away my fundamental human autonomy. They wanted the court to legally validate their theft under the guise of compassionate family care. Elliot turned to the next page of the dossier, explaining the devastating chain reaction caused by the forged medical documents. The private judge had granted Nathan a sweeping, irrevocable power of attorney based on the fake dementia diagnosis. Armed with that legal weapon, Nathan had marched directly into my primary banking institutions. He presented the court order and systematically seized total legal control over my personal checking accounts, my private investment portfolios, and the primary operating funds of Watkins Freight. The sheer scale of the betrayal was finally quantified in black and white. It was not a simple embezzlement scheme. It was a complete and total usurpation. Nathan had changed the locks on my physical house, and now he had changed the locks on my entire financial existence. Every safety net I had built over 50 years was legally under his command. The banks recognized him as the sole authority. To the legal and financial systems of the United States, Joseph Watkins was effectively a ghost. My identity had been legally erased, replaced by the signature of a greedy heir. Elliot warned me that Nathan could legally liquidate everything I owned by tomorrow morning. I stared at the forged power of attorney. I did not feel despair. I felt a cold, terrifying clarity. Nathan had built his entire operation on a foundation of forged paper. He believed a judge's stamp made him untouchable. Elliot's fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling raw data from the locked financial grid. The forged power of attorney had granted Nathan total access, but Elliot possessed the backdoor tracking codes built into the corporate framework years ago. A massive, extremely glaring anomaly flashed onto the secondary monitor. Elliot leaned forward, tracing the digital paper trail with a heavy gold pen. He looked at me, his jaw tightened in disbelief. Nathan was not just siphoning cash from the operational accounts. He was executing a complete liquidation of the company's core physical assets. Elliot brought up a commercial real estate listing that had been quietly pushed through an exclusive private brokerage. Nathan had listed the 60 acres of prime industrial land directly beneath our primary freight logistics hub. He had priced the vast acreage for a rapid under-the-market cash buyout of $20 million. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. This was not a slow bleed, it was a decapitation. Elliot tapped the screen, pulling up the escrow documents. Nathan had already secured a buyer. A foreign investment group had wired the earnest money 2 days ago. The final transfer deeds were drawn, reviewed, and waiting. Elliot read the timestamp on the digital escrow file. The closing signature was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. Nathan was less than 24 hours away from selling the literal ground my empire was built on, transforming my lifetime of blood and sweat into completely untraceable offshore cash. I demanded to know why Nathan was moving with such reckless velocity. A $20 million cash liquidation within 2 days of exiling me indicated sheer, unadulterated panic. Elliot launched a forensic deep dive into the corporate expense ledgers, stripping away the surface accounting masks Nathan had installed. The underlying reality of my son's leadership was immediately exposed. The logistics firm was bleeding capital at a highly unsustainable rate. Nathan had not merely mismanaged the complex freight routes. He had actively pillaged the company's operating reserves to construct his own hollow empire. Elliot pulled up a series of risky venture capital tech investments, all completely devoid of corporate oversight, all registering catastrophic financial losses. Nathan had poured millions of corporate dollars into vaporware startups, trying to prove he was a visionary investor rather than a simple logistics operator. The ongoing embezzlement did not stop at those tech investments. Elliot traced a massive continuous flow of capital redirected into a shell company owned exclusively by Meghan. Meghan's highly publicized luxury fashion boutique was a complete financial illusion. It generated zero actual profit. Nathan was using my freight company to subsidize her vanity project, bleeding my legacy dry to keep her dressed in designer labels and featured in local society magazines. The impending quarterly board review was scheduled for next Monday. The corporate auditors would inevitably discover the missing millions. Nathan was completely cornered. The $20 million land sale was a desperate maneuver. He needed the massive foreign cash injection to violently patch the gaping holes in the ledger before the board arrived. He was burning down my house to hide his own theft, convinced my forced exile would keep him entirely safe from any legal reckoning. The sheer arrogance of his plan was matched only by his absolute staggering financial incompetence. Elliot did not hesitate for a second. He immediately triggered a crisis response protocol, barking rapid commands to the 3 financial analysts standing by in the room. He ordered them to draft emergency injunction documents to freeze all corporate real estate assets and instantly halt the impending sale of the logistics hub. He reached for his desk phone again, informing me he was going to contact a federal prosecutor he kept on retainer. He intended to present the forged medical evaluation and the unauthorized bank transfers to secure an immediate arrest warrant for Nathan on charges of massive corporate fraud. The legal machinery was spinning into motion, preparing to obliterate my son before the sun went down. Elliot pulled a thick stack of printed injunction forms from his printer and grabbed his gold fountain pen. He began furiously signing the authorization lines, preparing to dispatch his legal couriers to the municipal courthouse. I watched his ruthless efficiency for a brief moment before taking physical action. I stepped across the mahogany desk and slammed my palm down flat over the freshly printed documents. The loud smack of my hand against the desk silenced the room instantly. The analysts stopped typing. Elliot froze, staring up at me with sheer confusion etched across his sharp features. He demanded to know what I was doing, reminding me that we had under 24 hours to prevent a $20 million catastrophe. I looked him dead in the eyes and ordered him to stop the injunction. I withdrew my hand from the paperwork and spoke with absolute, terrifying calmness. I explained my counter-strategy to the stunned room. I refused to file an emergency injunction to stop the real estate sale today. A simple injunction would only alert Nathan to my presence in the country. It would allow him to retreat, hire defense lawyers, and claim the fraudulent documents were a massive clerical error. I did not want to merely stop a bad business deal. I wanted to permanently eliminate the threat to my legacy. I instructed Elliot to let the transaction proceed exactly as scheduled. I wanted Nathan to sit at that polished closing table tomorrow afternoon. I wanted him to confidently look those foreign investors in the eyes and officially sign his name to the finalized transfer deeds. Filing a fake medical petition is a localized crime. Attempting to sell $20 million of commercial property he does not legally own, utilizing forged executive credentials to secure an international wire transfer, elevates the deception to massive federal wire fraud. I wanted Nathan to cross the point of no return in front of credible, high-profile witnesses. I wanted to see him completely trapped forever. Elliot pushed his chair back, visibly disturbed by the sheer magnitude of the risk I was proposing. He warned me that allowing Nathan to execute the final signature was an incredibly dangerous gamble. He explained that real estate transfers involving international wire funds move with lightning speed, once the ink dries on the escrow documents. If Nathan successfully finalized the transaction and the $20 million cleared the foreign accounts, the commercial land beneath the logistics hub would be legally gone. Regaining control of the physical acreage would require years of exhausting international litigation, potentially bankrupting the freight company in the process. Elliot stressed that standing by and watching a thief sign away the kingdom was not a strategy. It was corporate suicide. He pleaded with me to let him file the injunction and freeze the assets immediately, guaranteeing the physical property remained secure. I listened to his frantic legal assessment without a shred of anxiety. I placed my hands in my pockets and offered him a slow, measured smile. I assured Elliot that he did not need to worry about losing the land to a foreign investment firm. I told him the closing signature would be completely meaningless, regardless of how much money Nathan attempted to wire. Nathan was trying to sell a massive plot of commercial real estate he believed was owned by the Logistics Corporation. I calmly informed my attorney that the land simply could not be sold tomorrow, setting the stage for his ultimate inevitable ruin. The heavy mahogany doors of Elliot's office remained locked throughout the night. I refused the leather sofa in the corner, choosing instead to sit straight-backed in the high executive chair. The city lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows shifted from the vibrant glow of evening traffic to the cold, stark illumination of early morning. I did not sleep a single minute. The adrenaline pumping through my veins had crystallized into a state of hyper-focused clarity. Elliot and his analysts brought me boxes of archived corporate charters hauling decades of legal history out of the firm's fireproof vaults. I spent the dark hours meticulously reviewing 50 years of physical documents. I traced my own signature across endless pages of incorporation papers, asset declarations, and operating agreements. I verified every single trust document I had ever executed since the day I purchased my very first freight truck. I was not searching for an escape route. I was building a guillotine. I cross-referenced the exact legal boundaries of Nathan's forged power of attorney against the foundational bylaws of Watkins Freight. I mapped out the precise limitations of his stolen authority. I arranged the authentic original deeds into a single devastating sequence. Nathan believed his fraudulent medical evaluation had given him the master key to my entire empire. He failed to realize that I had forged the locks myself. By the time the sun began to breach the city skyline, my arsenal was completely prepared, weaponized, and ready for deployment. As I held the oldest yellowed contracts in my hands, the scent of aged paper pulled my memory backward. I recalled sitting in this exact same office 30 years ago. The room had featured different furniture back then, but the gravity of the space was identical. I had just buried my wife. The grief was a suffocating physical weight pressing down on my chest. Nathan was merely a child at the time, entirely unaware of the absolute devastation his mother's death had inflicted upon me. I sat across from Elliot's predecessor that afternoon with a singular, desperate focus. I needed to ensure that no matter what happened to me, the logistics empire I had built would survive to protect my son. I signed dozens of complex documents that day, transferring assets and securing corporate lifelines. But I remembered making one very specific legal decision during that agonizing afternoon. It was a fail-safe mechanism, a deeply buried structural condition designed to protect the core physical assets of Watkins Freight from external hostile actors or internal financial ruin. I never spoke a single word about this mechanism to anyone. I never mentioned its existence to Nathan when he took over the daily operations, assuming he would never face a threat severe enough to trigger it. I realize now that the threat I had been guarding against was not a rival corporation or an economic collapse. The ultimate threat was the boy I had been trying to protect. While I finalized my defensive perimeter, Elliot stood by the window and initiated the offensive strike. He bypassed local law enforcement entirely and dialed a highly secure number. He contacted 2 senior federal fraud investigators. Both agents owed Elliot's prestigious law firm a massive professional favor stemming from a complex corporate litigation case won 5 years prior. Elliot called in that debt without hesitation. The investigators arrived at the firm within the hour, stepping into the office with stern expressions and government credentials. Elliot did not waste their time with dramatic exposition. He spread the evidence directly across the glass conference table. He briefed the agents on the forged psychiatric evaluation, pointing out the fabricated signatures and the non-existent medical facility. He presented the fraudulent power of attorney Nathan had used to illegally hijack the corporate banking infrastructure. Finally, Elliot laid out the impending $20 million commercial land sale. He highlighted the precise timeline, emphasizing that the final closing signature with the foreign investment group was scheduled to occur at 2 o'clock this afternoon. The agents reviewed the paper trail in silence, quickly calculating the immense scale of the financial crimes. They recognized immediately that Nathan was not simply executing a family dispute. He was actively attempting to commit massive international wire fraud. The federal investigators locked their briefcases and confirmed their absolute participation. They agreed to accompany us to the brokerage, ready to spring the trap the exact second Nathan put his pen to the paper. The morning of the confrontation finally arrived, casting bright sunlight across the corporate skyline. I walked into Elliot's private executive washroom and washed the exhaustion from my face with freezing water. I needed to physically manifest the authority I was about to unleash. Elliot had dispatched his personal assistant to a luxury boutique an hour earlier. She returned holding a garment bag containing a sharp, meticulously tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white dress shirt, and a deep crimson silk tie. I discarded the comfortable, casual clothing Nathan had encouraged me to wear for my supposed retirement vacation. I dressed in silence, securing the heavy silver cufflinks at my wrists. I stared at my reflection in the vast mirror. The man staring back was not a confused, deteriorating dementia patient. He was not a helpless victim waiting to be exiled to a foreign continent. I shed the false image of the tired, compliant old man my son had projected onto me. I straightened my collar and felt the familiar heavy mantle of command settle securely onto my shoulders. I stepped out of the washroom and walked back into the executive suite. Elliot and the two federal agents stopped their conversation, immediately turning to acknowledge my presence. I had spent the last 5 years trying to be a gentle, supportive father in the background. That era was permanently over. I stepped firmly back into the role of the undisputed patriarch, ready to reclaim my stolen empire. We exited the skyscraper through the secure executive garage. A pristine black corporate town car idled near the elevators, its engine purring softly in the concrete cavern. The driver stood at attention and pulled the heavy rear door open. I climbed into the spacious back seat. Elliot slid in directly beside me, gripping his leather briefcase tightly in his lap. The two federal fraud investigators occupied the forward-facing jump seats, their expressions set in professional neutrality. The heavy doors clicked shut, sealing us inside the quiet, climate-controlled cabin. The driver navigated the vehicle out of the underground structure and merged seamlessly into the dense midday traffic. We drove toward the affluent northern district of the city, moving steadily closer to the luxury real estate brokerage where my son planned to finalize his massive theft. The ride was completely silent. There was no need for final motivational speeches or frantic last-minute adjustments. The strategy was locked into place. I watched the expensive retail storefronts blur past the tinted windows, visualizing the exact layout of the boardroom we were about to breach. Nathan believed he was minutes away from securing $20 million in untraceable foreign capital. He believed he had successfully erased his father and cemented his own absolute power. He had no idea that a town car carrying his total destruction was currently idling at a red light just 3 blocks away from his location. The trap was primed, and the consequences were about to be delivered. The perspective shifted entirely to the 42nd floor of the city's most exclusive commercial real estate brokerage. The glass-walled boardroom was bathed in the harsh, sterile light of a midday sun. Nathan sat squarely at the head of the massive, polished granite table. He projected an aura of absolute, unshakable confidence. He wore a brand-new, bespoke charcoal suit that subtly signaled immense corporate power. His posture was perfectly rigid, his shoulders pulled back to dominate the physical space of the room. He believed he was the undisputed king of Watkins Freight, entirely unaware of the fatal trap closing tightly around his perimeter. Megan sat directly to his right, her presence calculated and perfectly poised. She wore a tailored white designer dress, her hands resting elegantly on the granite surface. Beneath her calm, polished exterior, her mind operated like a high-speed calculator. She mentally divided the imminent $20 million wire transfer into specific categorized luxury purchases. She allocated millions to cover the massive hidden debts of her failing boutique. She carved out portions for international vacations, exotic sports cars, and a complete architectural overhaul of my primary estate. She viewed the pending transaction not as a business deal, but as her ultimate personal coronation. They both operated under the absolute delusion that their forged medical documents had provided them with total impenetrable legal immunity. They sat in the center of the glass room, basking in the artificial warmth of a stolen empire seconds away from executing their final theft. 3 senior representatives of a major European investment consortium sat opposite Nathan and Megan. They were wealthy, serious men who dealt exclusively in high-yield industrial acquisitions. They meticulously reviewed the final transfer deeds spread across the granite table. The setting was designed specifically to project the ultimate illusion of legitimate corporate success. The air in the room was climate-controlled to a perfect, crisp temperature. Heavy, expensive leather chairs absorbed the tension of the high-stakes negotiation. Crystal water glasses sweated faintly on silver coasters, catching the sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything in the room screamed of stability, wealth, and generational power. Nathan had utilized the impeccable 50-year reputation of Watkins Freight to blind the investors to the underlying fraud. The European representatives scrutinized the property lines, the zoning permits, and the environmental clearances for the 60 acres of commercial land beneath the logistics hub. They found 0 irregularities. The paperwork appeared absolutely flawless because it was generated by the very empire I had built. They had no reason to suspect that the man sitting at the head of the table possessed 0 legal authority to sell the ground beneath their feet. The lead investor, a gray-haired man with a stern, analytical gaze, traced his finger down the final page of the contract. He verified the escrow account routing numbers. The $20 million in foreign capital was already queued in the banking system, waiting only for a single authorization code to clear the international wire. The illusion of a mutually beneficial corporate transaction was absolute. The investors believed they were purchasing prime American industrial real estate. Nathan and Megan believed they were securing their permanent financial independence. The opulent boardroom held the collective weight of their mutual deception, completely insulated from the incoming storm. The lead investor slid the preliminary escrow release forms across the polished granite surface. Nathan picked up a heavy, customized fountain pen. He smoothly signed his name on the designated lines, locking in the final terms of the massive financial transfer. He leaned back in his leather chair and offered the investors a practiced, solemn smile. He spoke patronizingly about me to the foreign representatives. He lowered his voice, adopting the tone of a deeply burdened, genuinely loving son. He claimed the $20 million land sale was a tragic but necessary corporate sacrifice. He explained that my severe late-stage dementia required round-the-clock, highly specialized medical care. He stated the physical demands of my illness had forced him to liquidate core company assets to properly fund my continuous treatment facility. He painted himself as a tragic hero, a devoted child forced to dismantle his father's legacy purely out of medical necessity. The investors nodded with sympathetic expressions, completely accepting his fabricated narrative. They offered their polite condolences for my supposedly declining health. Nathan accepted their sympathy with a gracious, perfectly calibrated nod, utilizing my supposed mental destruction as the ultimate shield to finalize his monumental theft. The lead investor reached into his tailored suit jacket and extracted his own silver pen. He pulled the master transfer deed toward the center of his workspace. This single document represented the permanent handover of the commercial acreage. Once his ink touched the paper, the automated international banking system would instantly release the $20 million into the corporate accounts currently controlled exclusively by Nathan. The tension in the glass-walled boardroom reached its absolute suffocating peak. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning unit and the subtle shifting of expensive fabric. Megan leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked onto the tip of the silver pen. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, entirely unable to conceal the sheer predatory anticipation radiating from her rigid posture. Nathan kept his hands folded neatly on the table, projecting an image of calm, professional restraint, but the knuckles of his interlaced fingers were stark white. He was staring directly at his ultimate financial salvation. The $20 million would instantly erase his massive embezzlement zero out Megan's catastrophic boutique debts and completely secure his unchallenged position as the sole operator of Watkins Freight. The sheer gravity of the moment suspended the room in a state of hyper-focused anticipation. The lead investor uncapped his silver pen. He positioned the sharp metallic point directly above the final signature line. The greatest fraud of my son's entire life was literally seconds away from absolute permanent completion. The tip of the pen hovered less than an inch above the crisp white parchment. The final stroke of ink was absolutely imminent. The massive floor-to-ceiling glass doors of the boardroom suddenly shuddered. They slid open violently with a sharp, pressurized hiss that sliced through the suffocating silence of the room. The sudden mechanical noise acted like a physical blow, shattering the highly manufactured illusion of the corporate negotiation. The lead investor flinched, his hand jerking upward, pulling the silver pen away from the legal document. He turned his head sharply toward the entrance, his brow furrowing in severe annoyance at the blatant breach of protocol. Megan gasped audibly, her hands flying to her chest in shock as her $20 million fantasy was brutally paused. Nathan snapped his head toward the doorway, his perfectly constructed mask of corporate authority cracking instantly. His eyes widened in absolute paralyzing terror. The secure perimeter he firmly believed he had built around his theft evaporated into thin air. The carefully orchestrated sequence of actions, the forged documents, the calculated lies, and the imminent financial transfer were all interrupted permanently. The sterile, controlled environment of the executive suite was suddenly flooded with the heavy, undeniable weight of reality. The glass walls offered zero protection. The money was halted. The transaction was frozen in time. The carefully constructed lie my son had built to erase me was completely obliterated by the simple, defining sound of the sliding glass doors opening wide. I stepped through the threshold, crossing from the corridor into the climate-controlled sanctuary of the boardroom. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind me, sealing the room with a definitive, pressurized click. I did not walk with the hesitant, shuffling gait of a man suffering from severe cognitive decline. I moved with the heavy, deliberate stride of a founder reclaiming his territory. The tailored charcoal suit draped perfectly over my shoulders, replacing the image of the tired, exiled old man with the undeniable presence of the corporate patriarch. Elliot followed one step behind my right shoulder, his face a mask of absolute legal hostility gripping his leather briefcase like a weapon. The two federal fraud investigators entered last. They did not announce themselves or flash their badges. They simply moved to the back of the room, positioning their solid frames directly in front of the exit. They crossed their arms and stood with professional, intimidating neutrality, effectively transforming the luxury corporate suite into a locked federal interrogation room. The sudden shift in the physical dynamics of the space was instantaneous and absolute. The oxygen seemed to vanish from the room. I stopped at the opposite end of the long granite table, planting my feet squarely on the plush carpet. I did not say a single word. I simply let the devastating reality of my physical presence crash over the people who had spent the last 3 days trying to legally erase my existence. Nathan's hand went entirely slack. The heavy, customized silver fountain pen slipped from his fingers, and clattered loudly against the polished granite table, rolling to a stop, just inches away from the final signature line. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the perfectly silent room. I watched the blood drain completely from my son's face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. His jaw fell open, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, paralyzed by a level of terror that only accompanies absolute, irrefutable ruin. He was looking at a dead man walking. He had paid a fortune to ensure I was currently stranded in a foreign airport, on the other side of the planet, stripped of my assets and my autonomy. Yet here I stood, projecting absolute authority directly across his closing table. Megan's reaction was entirely physical. She let out a sharp, ragged gasp, a sound of pure, unadulterated panic. She slammed her hands against the edge of the granite table and pushed her heavy leather chair backward, desperate to put distance between herself and the reality of my arrival. The chair legs scraped harshly against the floor. Her flawless, manicured composure shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Her eyes darted wildly between my face, Elliot's stern expression, and the two broad-shouldered federal agents blocking the only exit. She instantly recognized that the meticulously constructed illusion of her impending $20 million wealth had just evaporated. The luxury vacations, the architectural renovations, and the salvation of her failing boutique died in that exact fraction of a second. She slumped back into her chair, her perfectly tailored white dress suddenly looking like a surrender flag. They were completely trapped in the wreckage of their own arrogance. I placed both hands flat on the cool granite surface, leaning forward slightly, to command the absolute attention of everyone seated at the table. I ignored Nathan and Megan, entirely directing my focus exclusively toward the three senior representatives of the European Investment Consortium. I offered them a polite, measured nod. I spoke with a terrifying, resonant calmness that cut right through the residual panic lingering in the air. I formally apologized to the gentlemen for my delayed arrival. I explained that my incoming flight had encountered unexpected logistical complications, forcing me to miss the preliminary introductions. The lead investor blinked in profound confusion, glancing down at the transfer deeds, and then back up at my face, struggling to reconcile the confident man standing before him with the tragic medical narrative he had just been fed. I continued without breaking eye contact. I stated clearly and unequivocally that as the sole founder, primary shareholder, and absolute owner of Watkins Freight, I had arrived to personally review the final documentation regarding the sale of my commercial property. I asked the lead investor if the escrow terms were satisfactory before we proceeded any further with my land. The sound of my voice finally snapped Nathan out of his paralyzing shock. The sheer desperation of a cornered animal took over his survival instincts. He slammed his palms down on the table and stood up violently, nearly knocking over his crystal water glass. His hands were shaking visibly, vibrating with a mixture of raw fear and adrenaline. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. His voice cracked as he ordered me to leave the boardroom immediately, his tone a pathetic imitation of executive command. He pivoted wildly toward the foreign investors, his words tumbling out in a frantic, hurried rush. He desperately attempted to reinforce the fraudulent narrative he had spent the last week constructing. He told the representatives not to listen to a single word I said. He stated with feigned tragedy that this exact situation was the heartbreaking reality of my severe condition. He claimed I was currently suffering from a massive, irreversible episode of late-stage dementia, entirely divorced from reality and completely unaware of my surroundings. He lied through his teeth, telling the room that I must have escaped from my specialized caregivers and wandered into the corporate offices by accident. He demanded that the investors ignore the interruption and allow him to contact medical security to have me safely restrained and escorted back to the isolation facility. He was doubling down on the forgery, betting everything on the illusion of my insanity. I did not raise my voice to interrupt his frantic monologue. I did not engage in a shouting match or attempt to defend my own sanity against his pathetic accusations. Arguing with a desperate liar only validates their manufactured reality. I simply stood at the end of the table and let his frantic, shaking voice echo against the glass walls until he ran out of breath. I allowed the silence to rush back into the room, amplifying his guilt. I turned my head very slowly and locked eyes with Elliot. I gave my attorney a single imperceptible nod. Elliot did not hesitate. He stepped forward, moving with the precise, lethal grace of an executioner. He unlatched the brass clasps of his briefcase and withdrew a massive, heavy red leather binder. He walked deliberately down the length of the granite table, bypassing the stunned European investors and stopping directly across from my son. Elliot raised the thick binder high into the air and slammed it down with devastating force directly on top of the master transfer deed Nathan had been about to sign. The heavy thud rattled the crystal water glasses and entirely eclipsed the forged paperwork. Elliot stared directly at Nathan, his eyes devoid of any professional courtesy. He announced to the room that the red binder contained the unalterable 50-year legal truth of Watkins' freight. The paper guillotine had officially dropped, and my son's neck was resting squarely on the block. Elliot did not even afford Nathan the courtesy of a glance. His attention remained entirely fixed on the 3 European representatives sitting frozen on the opposite side of the granite table. The lead investor still held his silver pen suspended in the air, his eyes darting between the heavy red binder and Elliot's uncompromising expression. Elliot introduced himself sharply, stating his name and his position as the senior legal counsel for the actual founder of Watkins Freight. He informed the distinguished gentleman that they had been brought into this room under a highly fabricated and incredibly dangerous pretense. He explained with brutal clarity that the man sitting at the head of their table, the man attempting to orchestrate a $20 million land sale, did not possess a single ounce of legal authority to execute the transaction. Nathan was not the owner of the logistics hub. He was not the managing director of the underlying physical assets. Elliot stated that Nathan Watkins was nothing more than a salaried operator, an employee granted temporary permissions to manage the daily freight routes and truck schedules. He possessed absolutely no equity in the acreage currently under negotiation. The European representatives shifted uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs, the magnitude of the situation dawning on their faces. Elliot pointed directly at the escrow documents scattered across the table. He advised the investors that authorizing any transfer of funds based on those fraudulent papers would immediately entangle their foreign consortium in an active, ongoing federal wire fraud investigation. He gestured toward the 2 silent federal agents standing by the glass doors, letting the presence of government authority validate his claims. Nathan opened his mouth to protest, a pathetic, strangled sound escaping his throat, but the sheer force of Elliot's professional dismantling rendered him completely mute. The illusion of my son's corporate supremacy was being systematically dismantled piece by piece. Elliot flipped the heavy red leather cover of the binder open, revealing thick stacks of aged notarized parchment. He turned the documents to face the investors, ensuring the authentic municipal stamps and verified signatures were clearly visible under the bright boardroom lights. He detailed the exact nature of the legal mechanism I had established 30 years ago, which had been finalized into its current form precisely 10 years prior. Following a period of profound personal loss, I had placed the entirety of the company's physical real estate, the massive logistics hub, the warehouses, and even my own personal estate into an irrevocable blind trust. I had separated the operational business of moving freight from the actual ground the trucks parked on. The holding firm managing the trust operated with absolute independence, entirely shielded from any internal corporate restructuring or familial disputes. Elliot explained that the private judge who had granted Nathan his fraudulent power of attorney earlier this week had only granted him access to the superficial operational accounts. A basic power of attorney, even one procured through highly expensive forgery, is entirely legally useless against an established, impenetrable blind trust. Nathan could drain the checking accounts and ruin the daily ledger, but he could never sell the concrete, the steel, or the dirt. He had spent the last 3 days strutting around the city believing he had successfully conquered a kingdom, completely unaware that he had only captured the courtyard. The fortress itself remained utterly locked, owned by a holding company he could never touch. The lead European investor stared at the notarized trust documents, his keen analytical mind instantly processing the sheer magnitude of the averted disaster. He looked at the federal agents guarding the exit, recognizing immediately that his consortium had been mere seconds away from wiring $20 million into a massive criminal vortex. The silver pen in his hand was no longer a tool of corporate acquisition. It had almost become the instrument of his own professional ruin. He capped the pen with a sharp, definitive click and slid it back into his tailored jacket pocket. Without uttering a single syllable, he reached across the granite table and collected his preliminary escrow paperwork. He snapped his leather briefcase shut, the locking mechanism echoing sharply in the tense room. The two other representatives followed his exact lead, gathering their belongings in synchronized, furious silence. They stood up from their heavy chairs, completely ignoring Nathan's frantic, pleading expressions. My son reached out a trembling hand toward the lead investor, desperately attempting to salvage the shattered negotiation. But the European executive did not even acknowledge his existence. The investors walked purposefully toward the glass doors, passing the federal agents, and exiting the boardroom without looking back. The massive $20 million transaction collapsed instantly, evaporating into the sterile, climate-controlled air of the luxury suite. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind the departing executives, sealing the remaining occupants inside a suffocating, absolute silence. The sudden absence of the investors left a profound void in the room, stripping away the final remnants of Nathan's corporate masquerade. Megan sat entirely frozen in her chair, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the granite table so tightly her knuckles had turned completely white. Her eyes were fixed on the empty leather chairs across from her, the reality of her impending financial ruin crashing down upon her shoulders. The designer boutiques, the luxury cars, and the high society status were gone, replaced by the terrifying prospect of insurmountable debt and legal prosecution. Nathan remained standing at the head of the table, his body swaying slightly, as if he had been physically struck. He slowly lowered his gaze to the open red binder resting on top of his forged transfer deeds. He stared at the irrevocable blind trust documents, his mind struggling to comprehend the devastating depth of his own ignorance. His entire reality, his overwhelming arrogance, and his brutal betrayal had been built entirely on land he had never owned. He had sacrificed his own father for a kingdom that was nothing more than a legal mirage. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and absolute, magnifying the sound of his rapid, shallow breathing. I moved deliberately around the perimeter of the long granite table, my footsteps entirely silent against the thick, plush carpet. I did not rush. I had spent days navigating the frantic chaos of my son's betrayal, and now I completely controlled the tempo of the room. I reached the empty leather chair recently vacated by the lead European investor and pulled it out. I sat down, slowly smoothing the jacket of my tailored suit, and folded my hands neatly on the polished surface. I was sitting directly across from my son, occupying the exact physical space where his financial salvation had just died. Nathan slowly lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, swimming with a pathetic mixture of terror and disbelief. He looked at me not as an exiled dementia patient, but as the man who had just dismantled his entire life without raising a finger. The fundamental nature of our confrontation shifted permanently in that precise moment. The dispute over commercial real estate, corporate leadership, and unauthorized bank transfers was entirely concluded. The business transaction was dead. The atmosphere in the glass-walled boardroom transformed from a high-stakes corporate negotiation into a brutal criminal reckoning. The two federal fraud investigators stepped away from the door, moving slowly into the center of the room. Elliot closed his red binder and stepped back, yielding the floor entirely to me. I looked directly into my son's terrified eyes, ready to deliver the exact consequences of his treason. The two federal fraud investigators moved with the synchronized precision of men who dismantle lives for a living. They stepped out from the shadows of the doorway and approached the polished granite table. The lead agent, a tall man with a face carved from granite, did not introduce himself or offer a polite greeting. He reached into his coat pocket and extracted a manila envelope, snapping it open with a sharp flick of his wrist. He extracted the glossy psychiatric evaluation Nathan had purchased to execute his coup. He laid the fraudulent document flat on the table directly next to the heavy red binder. Next, he produced a copy of the expedited court order granting the irrevocable power of attorney. The agent pressed his index finger firmly against the signature line of the medical decree. He informed Nathan that the physician listed on the document was currently sitting in a federal interrogation room, fully cooperating with a massive interstate medical fraud investigation. The agent's voice was devoid of any emotion as he methodically listed the incoming charges. He stated clearly that Nathan was officially under active federal investigation for attempted wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, corporate embezzlement, and severe elder financial abuse. He explained that attempting to leverage a fabricated medical condition to usurp a multi-million-dollar corporate entity carried mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. The walls of the boardroom seemed to shrink inward as the terrifying reality of the federal justice system settled heavily onto my son's shoulders. The threat of federal prison acts as an immediate solvent to conditional loyalty. Megan fractured the alliance the exact second the agent uttered the words, mandatory minimum sentencing. She pushed her chair back violently, the heavy leather scraping against the floorboards as she shot to her feet. The pristine, confident facade she had worn to orchestrate my ruin shattered into sheer desperate self-preservation. Her perfectly manicured hand shot out, pointing a trembling finger directly at her husband's face. She screamed that she knew absolutely nothing about any forged medical records. Her voice echoed off the glass walls, shrill and frantic, filling the boardroom with the unmistakable sound of a rat abandoning a sinking ship. She looked wildly at the federal agents and claimed she was entirely innocent of the corporate manipulation. She insisted that Nathan had manipulated her aggressively, lying about my cognitive decline to secure her cooperation. Megan rapidly spun a new, desperate narrative, casting herself as a victim of her husband's deceit. She shrieked that Nathan had forcefully coerced her into coordinating the massive moving crew at my estate. She claimed he had aggressively pressured her into signing the preliminary banking transfers under the guise of paying for my mandatory, high-end medical care. She was completely severing the marital bond to save her own skin. She threw every shred of their shared conspiracy squarely onto Nathan's shoulders, desperately offering him up to the federal investigators as a sacrificial lamb. She painted a picture of an abusive, controlling husband who had used her as an unwitting pawn in his grand embezzlement scheme. The devotion they had performed on my front lawn, celebrating openly amidst the wreckage of my dismantled home, completely disintegrated the moment the illusion of wealth was replaced by the imminent threat of steel handcuffs. Nathan stared at his wife in sheer unadulterated disbelief. His jaw slacked as he absorbed the velocity of her betrayal. He had burnt down his father's legacy, risked federal prison, and orchestrated a hostile corporate takeover solely to fund her extravagant lifestyle and silence her constant demands for elevated societal status. He had constructed his entire operation to give her the luxury she craved. Now he was watching the absolute evaporation of the loyalty he had sacrificed his own flesh and blood to secure. The moment the $20 million vanished from the table, her devotion vanished along with it. She did not hesitate to step over his body to secure her own survival. Nathan looked back and forth between the federal agents writing down her frantic confession and his wife screaming accusations at his face. The devastating realization finally crystallized in his bloodshot eyes. He had traded 50 years of unconditional paternal support for a transactional marriage built entirely on conditional wealth. He possessed absolutely nothing real. The empire he sought to steal was locked in a blind trust, and the woman he sought to impress was currently begging federal investigators for a plea deal at his expense. The crushing weight of complete isolation finally broke his rigid posture. Nathan physically collapsed back into his chair, his shoulders hunching forward in defeat. He looked past his screaming wife and the stoic lawyers, directing his desperate gaze entirely upon me. His voice shook violently as he begged the federal agents to wait outside the glass doors for just 5 minutes. He pleaded for a single private conversation with his father, desperately attempting to drag the confrontation out of the federal jurisdiction and back into the realm of a forgivable family dispute. The agents looked at Elliot, who offered a brief nod, allowing them to step backward toward the corridor without closing the doors. Nathan leaned across the granite table, his hands clasped together in a pathetic gesture of submission. He finally abandoned the sophisticated corporate vocabulary he used to justify his theft. He admitted everything in a rapid, tearful confession. He confessed to bleeding the freight company dry to cover catastrophic losses in high-risk tech ventures. He admitted to accumulating massive, dangerous debts that threatened to ruin his reputation. He used his status as my only child as a desperate shield against the incoming consequences. He cried that he was my own flesh and blood, my sole remaining heir. He begged me to fix the ledger, to utilize the blind trust, to pay off his mounting debts, pleading that a father could not possibly watch his only son be marched into a federal penitentiary. I remained entirely unmoved, sitting perfectly still in the heavy leather chair. The desperate tears streaming down his face generated absolutely no sympathy within my chest. I looked at the man who had orchestrated my exile, hired a corrupt doctor to erase my legal identity, and happily ordered the destruction of my late wife's personal belongings. I did not see my child sitting across the polished granite table. I saw a hostile corporate entity that had attempted a hostile takeover and failed miserably. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and spoke with a cold, absolute finality. I told Nathan that his actions had permanently severed the bloodline. I stated that a man who digs a grave for his father must ensure the father is actually dead before throwing the dirt. He had swung the shovel with total enthusiasm, entirely eager to bury me alive to secure his own financial comfort. I refused to offer a single shred of mercy. I explained that an inheritance is a privilege granted through respect, not a right extracted through forgery and deceit. I informed him that he would face the federal prosecutors without a single dime of corporate funding to pay for his defense attorneys. I stood up slowly, buttoning my tailored suit jacket towering over his defeated frame. I told him he would have to navigate the consequences of his ambition entirely on his own, leaving him completely trapped in the wreckage of his own design. I maintained my gaze on Nathan, watching the last remnants of his arrogant composure crumble into dust. He had pleaded for leniency under the guise of family loyalty, but family was a concept he had actively murdered the moment he forged my medical records. I interlaced my fingers on the granite table and delivered the verdict with absolute mechanical precision. I informed Nathan that his tenure as the managing director of Watkins Freight was officially and permanently terminated, effective this exact second. I did not offer a severance package or a grace period for him to collect his personal belongings. I methodically listed the immediate consequences of his termination. His corporate access credentials were already deactivated by Elliot's crisis team. The biometric locks on his executive office suite had been changed. His company-issued vehicles, his expense accounts, and his six-figure executive salary were entirely revoked. I watched his chest heave as the reality of his instant impoverishment set in. He had spent the last 3 days spending millions of dollars that did not belong to him, leveraging the company's operating capital to fund his reckless lifestyle. Now he was stripped of every single corporate benefit that had shielded him from the real world. He was no longer a powerful CEO holding court in a glass boardroom. He was simply an unemployed, heavily indebted man sitting across from the father he had tried to destroy. I told him he had mistaken my previous silence for weakness, and that miscalculation had just cost him his entire professional existence. Nathan opened his mouth to formulate another desperate excuse, but I raised my hand to silence him. The time for negotiations and pathetic apologies had expired the moment he attempted to sell my land to foreign investors. I turned my attention back to Elliot, who was standing quietly with the red leather binder. I gave my attorney a firm, decisive nod. I authorized Elliot to bypass standard corporate mediation and hand the complete unredacted financial dossiers directly to the federal fraud investigators waiting in the room. Elliot unzipped a secondary compartment of his briefcase and withdrew a thick sealed envelope. He stepped forward and placed the heavy envelope onto the granite table, sliding it directly toward the lead federal agent. I explained to my son that this envelope contained the final irrefutable pieces of evidence required to execute a federal arrest warrant. It contained the meticulously tracked wire transfers, proving he had siphoned operating capital into Megan's failing luxury boutique. It held the digital receipts of his high-risk, unauthorized venture capital gambles. But more importantly, it held the sworn affidavits from the private medical facility, confirming that the psychiatric evaluation he submitted to the private judge was a total, purchased fabrication. The lead investigator broke the seal on the envelope and pulled out the primary affidavit. He scanned the document, his sharp eyes verifying the signatures and the dates. He nodded once to his partner. The investigation phase of their operation was instantly concluded. The transition from corporate oversight to criminal prosecution was absolute. The lead federal agent stepped around the edge of the massive granite table, moving with the practiced, unyielding authority of law enforcement. He instructed Nathan to stand up and place his hands securely behind his back. Nathan's entire body shook violently as he pushed himself out of the heavy leather chair. He was weeping openly now, the tears streaming down his pale cheeks, ruining the meticulously cultivated image of a high society executive. The second agent moved in behind him, gripping his arms with firm, professional force. The stark, metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed sharply against the glass walls of the boardroom. The sound was a brutal, defining punctuation mark to my son's reign of deceit. It was a jarring, absolute contrast to witness the cold, unforgiving steel biting into the wrists of a man wearing a $5,000 bespoke suit and a silk tie. The armor of his extreme wealth and privilege offered zero protection against the federal criminal justice system. He sobbed uncontrollably, begging me one last time to stop the agents crying out that he was my flesh and blood. I remained seated, my expression entirely blank, completely immune to the emotional manipulation he had weaponized against me for years. The federal investigators flanked him on both sides. They gripped his tailored shoulders and marched him forcefully toward the sliding glass doors. They led my weeping, shattered son out of the luxury boardroom, pulling him away to face the devastating reality of a federal holding cell. The glass doors slid shut, sealing the boardroom once again. The chaotic noise of Nathan's arrest faded down the exterior corridor, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. Megan seized the momentary distraction to execute her own desperate retreat. She rose from her chair with extreme caution, her movements tight and completely silent. She reached for her expensive white cashmere designer coat draped over the back of her seat, clutching her luxury handbag tightly against her chest. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the carpet, attempting to slip out of the room, like a ghost escaping a graveyard. She had completely fractured her marital alliance minutes ago, throwing her husband to the federal authorities to save herself, and now she believed she could simply walk away from the wreckage she had helped engineer. She took 3 rapid, quiet steps toward the exit before I spoke. My voice cracked like a whip across the quiet room. I commanded her to stop exactly where she stood. Megan froze instantly, her shoulders stiffening under the cashmere fabric. She slowly turned around to face me, her perfectly manicured features twisted into a mask of pure apprehension. She attempted a weak, trembling smile, stammering that the legal matters only concerned Nathan and the logistics company, claiming she was merely a bystander caught in the crossfire. I stood up from the granite table and walked directly toward her. I informed her that her participation in my attempted exile guaranteed she would share equally in the punishment. I stood mere feet away from Megan, watching her eyes dart nervously around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. I explained that her extravagant lifestyle had been entirely subsidized by the stolen operating capital of Watkins Freight. She had happily directed the moving crew to throw my late wife's heirloom furniture into a dumpster to cleanse my estate for her own arrival. I informed her that the massive multi-million-dollar luxury penthouse she currently occupied downtown was not legally owned by Nathan. I told her the deed to that opulent residence was securely held within the exact same irrevocable blind trust that protected the commercial logistics hub. Nathan had simply been granted permission to reside there as a corporate perk, a perk that I had just permanently revoked. Elliot stepped forward, pulling a single crisp sheet of legal paper from his briefcase. He handed the document directly to Megan. I explained that she was holding a formal, court-approved eviction notice executed and signed by the holding company. I looked at her pale, horrified face and delivered my final directive. I granted her exactly 2 hours to return to the downtown penthouse. I instructed her to pack only her personal clothing and the cheap cosmetic items she had brought into the marriage. Everything else, the furniture, the art, and the vehicles, belonged to the trust. I told her that if she was not completely off my property in 120 minutes, I would have her arrested for criminal trespassing. I left Megan trembling in the boardroom and rode the executive elevator down to the underground parking garage. Hank was waiting beside the idling engine of my town car, his massive frame leaning against the black exterior. He read the absolute finality in my expression and opened the rear door without asking a single question. We drove away from the commercial district, leaving the ruined corporate hierarchy in our rearview mirror. The ride back to my primary estate was silent, filled with the heavy anticipation of the final physical reclamation. When we turned onto the long, familiar cobblestone driveway of my property, the scale of my son's arrogance was laid bare. 2 massive commercial moving trucks were parked directly in front of the grand entrance, their heavy diesel engines rumbling loudly. The front doors of my home were propped wide open, exposing the interior to the afternoon heat. A crew of workmen in matching gray uniforms was actively hauling my life out into the driveway. I watched a young worker carelessly carry a heavy oak side table across the threshold, bumping the fragile wooden leg against the stone pillar. It was a piece my late wife had spent months restoring by hand. Nathan and Megan had wasted absolutely no time executing their purge. They were actively gutting my history to make room for their sterile imported luxury. I did not wait for Hank to open my door. I pushed it open myself, stepping onto the cobblestones with the absolute authority of a man returning to claim his fortress. I walked directly up the front steps, bypassing the workers entirely, and located the moving foreman standing in the grand foyer. He was a burly man holding a digital clipboard, barking orders at his crew to work faster. He looked up at my approach, an annoyed expression crossing his face as he prepared to dismiss me as a wandering, confused neighbor. I did not give him the opportunity to speak. I reached inside my breast pocket and extracted a certified copy of the master holding trust and the authentic property deed. I slapped the heavy legal documents directly onto his clipboard. I informed him that the man who had hired his company possessed zero legal authority over this estate. I told him he was currently executing an unauthorized illegal removal of property owned by a holding firm, rendering his entire crew liable for criminal grand larceny. The foreman's annoyance evaporated the exact second his eyes scanned the embossed federal stamps and the explicit ownership clauses. He swallowed hard, recognizing the undeniable legal danger staring him in the face. He immediately lowered his radio and asked how I wanted to proceed to avoid prosecution. I delivered my orders with absolute, uncompromising precision. I instructed him to instantly reverse the operation. Every single piece of my furniture was to be unloaded from his trucks and returned to its exact original location. I then pointed toward the guest wing, which Nathan and Megan had prematurely occupied. I ordered the foreman to send his men upstairs and pack every single item belonging to my son and daughter-in-law. They were not to use the protective padding or the specialized wardrobe boxes. I demanded their designer clothing, expensive shoes, and luxury accessories be shoved aggressively into cheap standard cardboard shipping boxes. The foreman shouted a sharp command, and the entire momentum of the moving operation violently shifted direction. The workers scrambled to carry my wife's antique chairs and heavy wooden cabinets back through the front doors. A separate team rushed up the main staircase armed with flat, unassembled cardboard boxes and thick rolls of industrial packing tape. I stood on the front porch with Hank watching the physical manifestation of my son's eviction unfold in real time. Within 30 minutes, the crew began hauling heavy, unceremoniously sealed boxes down the stairs. They did not load them onto the moving trucks. Following my strict instructions, the workers carried the cardboard containers down the long, cobblestone driveway and dumped them directly outside the massive iron perimeter gates. The pile of cheap brown boxes grew rapidly, forming a pathetic mountain of ruined ambition on the public sidewalk. Megan's imported silk dresses and Nathan's expensive watches were unceremoniously tossed onto the concrete. It was an absolute, undeniable visual representation of their permanent expulsion. The estate was being physically purged of their parasitic presence. The physical distance between my pristine driveway and their discarded lives finalized the ruthless severance of our bloodline. With their belongings rotting on the street, I turned my attention to the physical security of the perimeter. Hank had already anticipated my next directive. He led a trusted, highly discreet private locksmith up the front steps. The technician moved methodically from door to door, drilling out the heavy brass cylinders of the deadbolts. I watched the metal shavings fall to the floor, as every single access point was permanently altered. Nathan and Megan's silver keys were rendered entirely useless. I walked over to the main security panel mounted on the foyer wall. I typed in my master override sequence, navigating through the digital menus to access the biometric logs. I aggressively deleted Nathan's fingerprints from the system. I erased Megan's access codes. I changed the master alarm sequence to a complex numeric string they could never possibly guess. I walked through the secondary entrances, the garage access doors, and the garden gates, verifying that the locksmith had replaced every lock mechanism with high-grade, impenetrable steel hardware. Hank stood guard by the iron front gate, ensuring the electronic motor was fully engaged, locking the heavy metal bars together with a resounding metallic clank. The perimeter was entirely locked down. I had systematically stripped them of their corporate power, dismantled their financial immunity, and now I had physically barred them from the only sanctuary they believed they had conquered. The fortress was fully restored to its rightful sovereign. The heavy diesel engines of the commercial moving trucks roared to life and drove away, leaving a profound, absolute stillness over the estate. Hank nodded respectfully and stepped outside to begin a final patrol of the grounds. I stood completely alone in the exact center of my vast living room. The afternoon sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting warm golden light across the polished oak floorboards. The air was finally clear, entirely free from the suffocating toxic weight of my son's desperate ambition and his wife's endless greed. I looked around the room, taking in the familiar, comforting shapes of my history. The crew had followed my orders perfectly. My late wife's antique reading chair was positioned exactly by the front window, where she used to watch the sunrise. The restored wooden side table rested securely against the far wall, bearing zero damage from the aborted theft. The environment reflected absolute order and unshakable respect once again. I walked over to the antique chair and ran my hand slowly along the smooth, polished wood of the armrest. I did not feel any lingering sorrow for the son I had just banished to a federal holding cell. I felt only the deep, resonant peace of a man who had successfully defended his legacy against a brutal siege. The storm had passed, the traitors were permanently exiled, and the quiet dignity of my home was completely reclaimed. The morning air was crisp and sharply cold as Hank pulled the town car up to the main entrance of Watkins Freight headquarters. I had not set foot in this building for over 8 months. Nathan had utilized my absence to propagate his vicious narrative, seeding the logistics floor with whispers of my rapidly deteriorating mind. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked through the double-glass doors with the deliberate, heavy stride of a man reclaiming his territory. The bustling hum of the active dispatch floor died instantly. Dozens of coordinators, logistics managers, and freight trackers stopped mid-sentence. Phones rang unanswered. The employees stared at me in profound shock, their eyes wide as they tried to reconcile the robust, sharp-suited man standing before them with the tragic, senile invalid my son had described. I did not offer a comforting smile or a weak wave. I walked straight down the central aisle, the sound of my leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the polished concrete. The physical space still hummed with the operational rhythm I had established decades ago. I could see the confusion shifting into deep realization across the faces of my senior staff. The rumors of my mental collapse were instantly obliterated by my physical presence. I moved with absolute purpose toward the executive suite, feeling the toxic shadow of my son's brief, fraudulent reign evaporate with every step I took. The founder had returned, and the era of Nathan's parasitic management was officially over. I instructed my executive assistant, who was nearly trembling with relieved shock at my arrival, to immediately page a mandatory company-wide meeting on the main dispatch floor. Within 10 minutes, every employee in the building had gathered. I stood on the elevated platform overlooking the sea of faces gripping the edge of the steel railing. I spoke with a resonant, booming authority that commanded absolute silence. I did not indulge in emotional theatrics or expose the humiliating details of my son's federal arrest and criminal forgery. The dispatch floor was a place of business, not a theater for family tragedy. I announced clearly and firmly that Nathan was no longer affiliated with Watkins Freight in any capacity. I framed his sudden departure as an immediate and permanent corporate restructuring. I informed the staff that all directives, contracts, and operational protocols initiated by Nathan during his tenure were currently under strict executive review. I watched the collective tension in the room release. The underlying anxiety of working under a reckless, erratic operator vanished. I demanded their absolute focus and dedication to our core logistics contracts. I assured them that the financial foundation of the company was unshakable and that we were returning to the disciplined, aggressive operational standards that had built this empire. I maintained total, unyielding professional control, projecting the exact type of relentless stability the company desperately needed after months of chaotic, invisible mismanagement. The company was no longer a piggy bank for corporate vanity. It was a freight empire, and it was back under my absolute command. I stepped down from the platform and walked directly toward the routing desks. I had spent the early hours of the morning reviewing the raw performance metrics and operational logs generated during my forced absence. The data revealed a stark reality. While Nathan was busy embezzling funds and planning my forced commitment, a young shift manager named David had been single-handedly holding the domestic freight network together. David was a quiet, relentless worker who routinely pulled 14-hour shifts to cover the logistical disasters caused by my son's negligence. He had personally rerouted 12 major shipments during a winter storm, while Nathan was out of the state purchasing luxury vehicles with company capital. I stopped directly in front of David's workstation. He stood up immediately, brushing his hands against his slacks, his face tight with nervous anticipation. I did not offer him empty corporate platitudes. I looked him dead in the eye and publicly listed his specific operational triumphs from the past 6 months. I made sure every single employee on the floor heard the exact numerical value he had saved the company through sheer grinding competence. I announced right then and there that David was officially promoted to Director of Operations, effective immediately. A murmur of genuine shock and immediate approval rippled through the gathered employees. I handed David the master routing keys that had been confiscated from Nathan the previous afternoon. I told the room that from this exact second forward, this company would operate on a pure meritocracy. Bloodline and unearned privilege would no longer dictate corporate hierarchy. Unwavering loyalty, brutal efficiency, and undeniable competence were the only currencies I recognized. David accepted the keys with a firm nod, understanding the massive weight of the responsibility I had just handed him. The message was absolute. I left David to take control of the dispatch floor and retreated to the executive suite with Elliot. The two of us locked the door and initiated a brutal forensic audit of the corporate accounts. Nathan had treated the operational capital like his own personal casino fund. I reviewed the ledgers detailing his reckless venture capital gambles and unauthorized investments in failing tech startups. I did not hesitate. I aggressively liquidated every single side project and vanity investment my son had initiated. I absorbed the immediate financial penalties of breaking those contracts, prioritizing long-term stability over short-term pride. I systematically clawed back the bleeding capital and immediately redirected every single recovered dollar straight into our core freight business. I authorized the purchase of new rig engines and approved the overdue pay raises for our veteran drivers. By cutting off the financial parasites my son had attached to the company, I stabilized the entire corporate structure in a matter of hours. The bleeding stopped entirely. The company's massive revenue streams were no longer being siphoned off to fund luxury penthouses and bespoke suits. Watkins Freight was once again a lean, focused, and utterly ruthless machine, stripped of the dead weight that had nearly dragged it under. As the sun began to set over the industrial park, I walked alone into the glass-walled boardroom. The space was completely silent, a stark contrast to the chaotic, panicked federal arrest that had taken place here just 24 hours ago. I walked slowly to the head of the polished granite table and took my seat. I looked directly across the long, empty surface at the vacant leather chair where my son used to sit. The chair where he had arrogantly planned my total destruction. I sat in the gathering shadows and searched my chest for any lingering trace of paternal grief or regret. I found absolutely nothing. The man who had occupied that chair was a treacherous, greedy impostor who had viewed my death as a convenient financial milestone. I realized with absolute cold clarity that protecting my life's work, my loyal employees, and my own survival required cutting out the rot completely and without hesitation. A diseased limb cannot be saved by ignoring the infection. It must be brutally amputated to save the body. I had severed the bloodline to save the empire. I watched the city lights flicker to life outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp reflections across the empty boardroom table. My legacy was secure. My estate was reclaimed. The traitors were exiled to the harsh reality of their own consequences. I was completely alone in the silent room, but I had never felt more powerful. The harsh, chaotic noise of the preceding weeks gradually dissolved into a profound, sustaining quiet. 6 months after the ruthless severance of my son from my corporate and personal life, I established a completely new rhythm. I woke up every morning well before dawn, completely free from the suffocating anxiety that used to grip my chest. I walked out onto my front porch with a steaming mug of strong black coffee breathing in the crisp morning air. The massive iron gates at the end of the cobblestone driveway stood as silent, unyielding sentinels. I watched the sun slowly rise over my restored estate, casting a warm golden light across the manicured lawns. My mornings were no longer consumed by repairing the reckless damage caused by Nathan's financial gambling. I spent my time reviewing streamlined operational reports from Watkins Freight. The logistics company was not merely surviving my son's departure. It was actively thriving. David, the young shift manager I had promoted to director of operations, ran the domestic freight network with absolute grinding efficiency. The dispatch floor hummed with a renewed, energetic discipline. Morale had skyrocketed the exact moment the employees realized that competence, not bloodline, dictated their future. I reviewed the quarterly profit margins from my porch, noting the sheer financial velocity of a business finally stripped of its parasitic dead weight. The empire I built was secure, managed by capable individuals who respected the machinery of the operation rather than viewing it as a personal vanity fund. Sitting in the morning stillness, I spent long hours reflecting on the fundamental nature of unconditional love. For 45 years, I operated under the fatal delusion that a father's duty was to provide an endless, unquestioning shield against the harsh realities of the world. I believed that absorbing Nathan's failures and quietly financing his ambition was the ultimate expression of paternal devotion. I realized looking back at the wreckage he attempted to create that love without strict, immovable boundaries is nothing more than a formal invitation for exploitation. By refusing to let my son face the brutal consequences of his own arrogance, I had actively crippled his moral development. I had manufactured a monster clothed in a bespoke suit, a man completely insulated from empathy and completely driven by bottomless greed. The moment I allowed my wealth to substitute for accountability, I forfeited his respect. He did not see a loving father. He saw a vulnerable treasury waiting to be plundered. Genuine love requires the courage to say no. It requires the absolute fortitude to watch someone you care about hit rock bottom when they choose the path of deceit. I understood finally that my silence over the years had been weaponized against me. I had armed my executioners with my own passive generosity. The pain of that realization was sharp, but it was a completely necessary suffering. It purged the lingering guilt from my conscience and replaced it with an unbreakable crystalline clarity regarding my own worth. I had to sever the cord completely to reclaim my own life and protect the legacy I had built. My new reality was not built entirely on solitude. I chose to surround myself strictly with individuals who demonstrated unwavering, unpurchased loyalty. Later that afternoon, I arrived at a quiet, upscale downtown restaurant for a scheduled lunch. Hank was already seated in a private corner booth, his massive frame radiating quiet, protective vigilance. Sitting across from my driver was Oliver, the young man who had recognized me at the foreign airport and flatly refused to accept Nathan's fabricated narrative. Oliver had risked his own professional standing to alert Elliot, proving that his moral compass could not be bought or intimidated. He had proven that his character was a rare and valuable asset. I took my seat and ordered lunch, treating both men with the absolute respect they had rightfully earned. I had not allowed Oliver's integrity to go unrewarded. Shortly after the federal agents escorted Nathan out of the boardroom, I officially hired Oliver as the senior security consultant for Watkins Freight and the holding trust. I offered him a generous corporate salary and complete oversight of our digital and physical perimeters. Oliver possessed the exact kind of sharp, incorruptible vigilance I required to safeguard my restored empire. During our meal, we did not discuss the miserable fate of my son or the legal ruin facing his wife. We discussed the future. We talked about advanced security protocols, logistics expansion, and the implementation of rigorous internal audits. I looked at the two men sharing my table and felt a deep, resonant satisfaction. I had successfully replaced toxic entitlement with genuine, tested character. The greatest misconception surrounding the elderly is the lethal assumption that age equates directly to weakness. Society frequently observes a slow gait or graying hair and instantly perceives a target ripe for exploitation. Nathan and Megan had fallen squarely into this arrogant trap. They looked at my quiet demeanor and mistook my deliberate silence for complete compliance. They believed my physical aging signaled a parallel decay of my intellect, assuming I was entirely oblivious to the predatory maneuvers happening directly inside my own home. They failed to comprehend that silence is often a tactical weapon. A quiet man is an observing man. True justice is rarely achieved through loud emotional outbursts or chaotic screaming confrontations. The most devastating form of justice is achieved by simply allowing greedy individuals the uninterrupted space to trap themselves in their own blinding arrogance. I gave my son enough rope to build his fraudulent kingdom, watching patiently as he entangled himself in federal crimes and irreversible debt. I let them commit entirely to their treacherous illusion before I pulled the legal foundation right out from under their feet. The gravity of their own ambition did the heavy lifting. They were crushed not by my vengeance, but by the unavoidable crushing weight of their own meticulously planned deceit. Age brings a ruthless, calculated patience. It provides the profound ability to play the long game, prioritizing a flawless, devastating checkmate over the fleeting satisfaction of an immediate argument. I simply waited for the perfect moment to drop the guillotine. I returned to my primary estate just as the late afternoon sun began its slow descent below the horizon. The sky exploded in brilliant shades of burnt orange and deep violet, casting long, sharp shadows across the pristine, manicured lawns. The commercial moving trucks were a distant, forgotten memory. The toxic noise of ungrateful airs had been permanently scrubbed from the atmosphere. I walked up the stone steps of the front porch and placed my hand on the heavy brass handle. I stepped inside the grand foyer and firmly pushed the massive oak door shut. The heavy steel deadbolts engaged with a loud definitive click, locking out the chaos of the world. I walked slowly into the center of my living room. The environment was immaculate. My late wife's antique furniture remained exactly where it belonged, surrounded by an atmosphere of absolute, unbroken serenity. The air was cool, clean, and completely mine. I moved toward my favorite leather reading chair, positioned perfectly by the large bay window. I sat down, feeling the familiar comforting support of the worn leather against my back. I looked out over the vast expanse of my property as the evening twilight began to claim the sky. The fortress was entirely secure. The business was thriving. The traitors were banished to the dark corners of federal holding cells. I rested my hands on the armrests, breathing deeply and evenly. I was utterly at peace and firmly, irrevocably in control of my own destiny. The harsh winter frost gave way to a brilliant, forgiving spring, mirroring the profound shift within my own life. I established a new, unbreakable rhythm, rising at 4 a.m, long before the rest of the city awoke. The crushing weight of betrayal no longer anchored me to my bed. I carried a steaming mug of black coffee out onto my wraparound porch, breathing deeply as the crisp air filled my lungs. I watched the early sunlight slowly illuminate the vast, manicured expanse of my estate. The massive iron gates at the perimeter remained firmly sealed, serving as absolute physical boundaries against the chaos I had systematically expelled. My mornings were no longer defined by dread or the desperate need to untangle Nathan's catastrophic financial webs. I spent those quiet hours reviewing daily operational reports sent directly to my secure tablet. Watkins Freight was operating with a brutal, flawless efficiency. David had taken command of the logistics network with an unyielding dedication that exceeded my highest expectations. The dispatch floor thrived under a pure meritocracy, completely free from the toxic nepotism that had nearly destroyed it. I observed the surging profit margins and the renewed morale of my veteran drivers with deep satisfaction. I was no longer an exhausted patriarch funding the delusions of a greedy heir. I was the active, vigilant overseer of a highly secure, incredibly profitable empire surrounded exclusively by capable people who earned their positions through unwavering competence and absolute loyalty. Sitting in the deep silence of my porch, I allowed my mind to process the final, unavoidable truths of the past 6 months. For decades, I had operated under the deeply flawed assumption that paternal love required limitless sacrifice. I had convinced myself that absorbing my son's failures, masking his profound inadequacies, and financing his unchecked arrogance were the ultimate expressions of unconditional devotion. I reflected on the monumental wreckage he had attempted to create, realizing with cold clarity the true nature of my mistake. Love without strict, uncompromising boundaries is nothing more than a formal invitation for exploitation. By refusing to let Nathan face the severe consequences of his own greed, I had actively crippled his moral compass. I had constructed a monster who viewed my affection as a weakness and my wealth as an entitlement. The moment I substituted financial bailouts for genuine accountability, I forfeited his respect. He did not see a father protecting him. He saw a vulnerable treasury waiting to be bled dry. I recognized that genuine love requires the absolute fortitude to say no. It demands the courage to watch someone you care about hit rock bottom when they consciously choose the path of deceit. My previous silence and limitless generosity had been weaponized against me, arming my executioners. Acknowledging that failure was a sharp, biting pain, but it was a completely necessary suffering. It purged the lingering guilt from my chest, replacing it with an impenetrable, crystalline understanding of my own inherent worth. I did not allow my new reality to be defined entirely by isolation. I actively chose to surround myself with individuals who had demonstrated unpurchased, undeniable integrity. Later that week, I arrived at a highly secure private dining club downtown. Hank walked beside me, his massive frame projecting his usual aura of quiet, lethal vigilance. We were directed to a secluded booth, where a young man was already waiting. It was Oliver, the observant stranger from the foreign airport, who had flatly refused to accept Nathan's fabricated narrative. Oliver stood up immediately, offering a firm, respectful handshake. He had risked his own professional standing and personal safety to contact Elliot, proving that his moral compass could not be intimidated by wealth or corporate status. I did not allow character like that to go unrewarded. Shortly after Nathan's arrest, I had officially brought Oliver into the fold. I hired him as the senior security consultant for Watkins Freight and the overarching holding trust. I granted him a lucrative corporate salary and complete executive oversight of our digital and physical security protocols. During our lunch, we did not discuss the miserable reality of my son facing federal prosecutors or Megan's sudden descent into poverty. We focused entirely on the future. We discussed advanced logistical tracking threat assessment and the implementation of rigorous internal audits. I looked at Hank and Oliver sharing my table, feeling a profound satisfaction. I had successfully replaced parasitic entitlement with tested, unbreakable character. The greatest misconception surrounding the elderly is the lethal assumption that chronological age equates directly to physical and mental weakness. Society frequently observes graying hair and a deliberate pace, instantly perceiving a vulnerable target ripe for absolute exploitation. Nathan and Megan had fallen squarely into this arrogant, fatal trap. They looked at my quiet demeanor and tragically mistook my calculated silence for complete compliance. They believed my physical aging signaled a parallel decay of my intellect, assuming I was entirely oblivious to the predatory maneuvers happening directly beneath my own roof. They failed to comprehend that silence is frequently a highly sophisticated tactical weapon. A quiet man is an observing man. True, lasting justice is rarely achieved through loud emotional outbursts or chaotic screaming confrontations in the middle of a living room. The most devastating, permanent form of justice is achieved by simply allowing greedy individuals the uninterrupted space to trap themselves in their own blinding arrogance. I had given my son exactly enough rope to build his fraudulent corporate kingdom. I watched patiently as he entangled himself in federal wire fraud, extreme identity theft, and irreversible debt. I let them commit entirely to their treacherous illusion before I pulled the legal foundation right out from under their feet. The crushing gravity of their own ambition executed the punishment. They were destroyed not by my active vengeance, but by the unavoidable crushing weight of their own meticulously planned deceit. Age brings a ruthless, calculated patience. I returned to my primary estate just as the late afternoon sun began its slow, vibrant descent below the horizon. The sky exploded in brilliant shades of burnt orange and deep violet, casting long, sharp shadows across the pristine, manicured lawns. The commercial moving trucks and the toxic noise of ungrateful heirs had been permanently scrubbed from the atmosphere. I walked up the stone steps of the front porch, the crisp evening air cooling my skin. I stepped inside the grand foyer and firmly pushed the massive oak door shut. The heavy steel deadbolts engaged with a loud definitive click, locking out the chaos of the outside world. I walked slowly into the center of my living room. The environment was immaculate. My late wife's antique furniture remained exactly where it belonged, surrounded by an atmosphere of absolute unbroken serenity. The air in the house was cool, clean, and completely mine. I moved toward my favorite leather reading chair, positioned perfectly by the large bay window. I sat down, feeling the familiar, comforting support of the worn leather against my back. I looked out over the vast expanse of my property as the evening twilight began to claim the sky. The fortress was entirely secure. The business was thriving independently. The traders were banished to the dark corners of federal holding cells. I rested my hands on the armrests, breathing deeply and evenly. I was utterly at peace and firmly irrevocably in control of my own destiny. Another profound lesson extracted from this ordeal revolves around the fundamental distinction between the illusion of authority and the true nature of power. Throughout the entirety of his fraudulent campaign, Nathan operated under the disastrous misconception that power could be manufactured through external symbols. He firmly believed that assuming control of a glass-walled boardroom, wearing a $5,000 bespoke suit, and wielding a heavy silver fountain pen, automatically imbued him with absolute corporate supremacy. He confused the theatrical performance of leadership with the actual grinding mechanics of ownership. This is a common and fatal error made by individuals driven exclusively by greed rather than competence. They seek the crown without understanding the immense unyielding weight of the kingdom. Nathan assumed that because he possessed the aesthetic markers of success, the underlying foundation would simply bend to his will. He did not comprehend that true power does not reside in the volume of a man's voice or the aggressive posture he adopts during a meeting. True power resides in the quiet, unshakable bedrock of legal ownership, strategic foresight, and unwavering competence. When we analyze the mechanics of his betrayal, we see a man desperately attempting to construct an empire using stolen materials. He manipulated the legal system, bribed medical professionals, and terrorized employees to create a facade of invincibility. Yet his entire operation was inherently fragile because it was built on a foundation of continuous lies. Every step he took required another layer of deception to maintain the illusion. The moment one variable shifted, the entire structure was destined to collapse. This illustrates the exhausting, unsustainable nature of unearned authority. A person who steals their position must constantly look over their shoulder, living in perpetual terror of discovery. They are never truly secure, regardless of how much stolen capital they hoard or how many luxury penthouses they occupy. The psychological toll of maintaining a massive fraud eventually degrades the perpetrator's ability to think clearly. Nathan became so intoxicated by his own fabricated reality that he completely lost the capacity for objective risk assessment. He blinded himself to the obvious legal vulnerabilities of his plan, convincing himself that his sheer audacity would somehow override federal law. Conversely, true power operates in absolute silence. It does not require validation, applause, or aggressive posturing. I spent 10 years quietly building an irrevocable blind trust to safeguard my assets not out of paranoia, but out of a profound understanding of human nature. I understood that wealth attracts parasites, and the only reliable defense against parasitic ambition is a flawlessly executed legal perimeter. I did not need to boast about the structural integrity of my estate, or remind my son of the specific legal mechanisms protecting my business. True power allows the architect to rest easily, knowing the defenses will hold regardless of the adversary's volume. When Nathan initiated his coup, I did not retaliate with immediate chaotic emotion. I retreated, observed the battlefield, and allowed his aggressive incompetence to expose his flanks. I possessed the true power of patience, a virtue entirely absent in those consumed by immediate gratification. I understood that a rushed defense often leads to critical errors. By waiting for the precise moment of maximum exposure, I ensured his defeat would be absolute and irreversible. This ordeal serves as a stark warning about the dangers of superficial ambition. We currently live in a culture that frequently rewards the appearance of success over the actual achievement of it. People are encouraged to project wealth, project authority, and project competence regardless of the underlying reality. Nathan was a product of this toxic mindset. He wanted the prestige of being a logistics magnate without ever learning how to route a freight truck during a winter storm. He wanted the financial rewards of a grueling 50-year career delivered instantly into his lap without lifting a finger. His story demonstrates that reality will always inevitably assert itself. The market, the legal system, and the fundamental laws of cause and effect cannot be permanently bypassed through forgery. Eventually, the bill comes due. The people who survive and thrive are those who respect the fundamental mechanics of reality. They understand that success is a byproduct of relentless discipline, ethical consistency, and long-term strategic planning. Furthermore, this situation highlights the critical importance of maintaining strict operational secrecy regarding one's ultimate capabilities. If I had openly flaunted the existence of the holding firm or the blind trust, Nathan would have adjusted his strategy. He might have found a different, perhaps more insidious avenue of attack. By keeping my primary defenses completely hidden, I allowed him to expend his energy attacking a decoy. He exhausted his resources, destroyed his own reputation, and committed multiple federal crimes trying to conquer a castle that was legally impenetrable. The element of surprise is the most devastating weapon in any conflict. Never reveal the full extent of your resources, your legal protections, or your intellectual capacity to anyone, especially those who stand to gain from your downfall. The ability to absorb a perceived defeat while secretly holding the winning hand requires immense emotional control. It requires the subjugation of the ego. Most people desperately want to correct an insult, immediately driven by the burning need to prove their superiority. Suppressing that urge is the hallmark of true, unassailable power. In conclusion, the ultimate lesson is that character cannot be forged. An individual either possesses the internal fortitude to achieve success ethically or they do not. When faced with a person lacking that fundamental integrity, no amount of financial generosity or parental guidance will correct their course. They must be allowed to meet the brutal consequences of their own actions. The resulting destruction is not a failure of the victim, but the natural, unavoidable outcome of the perpetrator's arrogance. A quiet life secured by impenetrable boundaries and surrounded by proven loyalty is the only genuine victory. True security is achieved when you no longer need to raise your voice to command the room, knowing that the foundation holds. If you found value in this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know how you would handle this situation.